December 16, 1944. The Ardennes forest. Snow blankets the pine trees. German soldiers advance through the pre-dawn darkness, their boots crunching through knee-deep drifts. They are part of Hitler's final desperate gamble, a massive offensive designed to split the Allied forces in two. More than 200,000 men surge forward. Tanks rumble through narrow forest roads. Artillery thunders in the distance. The Americans, caught completely off guard, are retreating in chaos. For the German High Command, everything is going according to plan. They have no idea that in the shells loaded into American howitzers, a secret weapon waits. A device so revolutionary, so closely guarded, that its security classification matches that of the atomic bomb. When those shells begin falling, German soldiers will experience something that defies all their combat training, all their tactical knowledge. Explosions erupting from thin air, 20 feet above their heads. Shrapnel raining down into foxholes, into trenches, into positions that should have been safe. They will have no warning, no time to take cover. The shells arrive faster than the speed of sound. And for the elite SS units advancing through the forest, confident in their combat prowess, the killing will be unlike anything they have ever experienced. Subscribe to this channel and comment where you are watching from, because the story of this secret shell, the weapon that turned the tide of the deadliest battle in American military history, is one of the most remarkable technological achievements of the Second World War. To understand how Allied scientists created a device that seemed to violate the laws of physics, you need to travel back to the desperate early years of the war. 1940. Britain stands alone against Nazi Germany. The Luftwaffe rains bombs on London night after night. Anti-aircraft gunners fire thousands of rounds into the dark sky, their shells bursting harmlessly far from the German bombers. The statistics are devastating. Estimates at the start of the Blitz suggested it took between 2,500 and 100,000 rounds to shoot down a single aircraft. Some calculations put the figure at 20,000 shells per kill. The problem was fundamental to artillery technology. Shells detonated in only two ways. Either they struck the target directly, which required impossibly accurate aim against a fast-moving aircraft, or they used a timed fuse, which required gunners to perfectly predict the altitude and timing of enemy planes. Neither method worked reliably. Admiral Arleigh Burke, who commanded a destroyer fleet in the Solomon Islands, would later describe the frustration. Mechanical time fuses, which we had been using, only brought down a plane at night by accident. They were good for harassing enemy aircraft at night, but that was about all. The mathematics of air defense were simply against the defenders. A 5-inch anti-aircraft shell has an effective blast radius of about 70 yards. An aircraft flying at 300 miles per hour covers that distance in less than a second. Miss by a fraction of a second in your timing, and the shell explodes harmlessly behind or in front of the target. British scientists had recognized the need for a proximity fuse as early as the late 1930s. A team including Samuel Curran, William Buteman, Edward Shire, and Amherst Thompson at the Telecommunications Research Establishment conceived of a revolutionary idea. What if a shell could detect when it was close to a target and detonate itself automatically? The concept seemed simple. The execution was anything but. They envisioned using a miniature Doppler radar inside the shell itself. The radar would transmit a continuous signal. When that signal reflected off a nearby target, the change in frequency caused by the relative motion, the Doppler effect, would trigger detonation. British tests using unrotated projectiles, their cover name for unguided rockets, showed promising results. But rockets experience relatively gentle acceleration. Anti-aircraft shells were another matter entirely. When fired from a 5-inch naval gun, a shell experiences acceleration equal to 20,000 times the force of gravity. The shell spins at 500 revolutions per second from the rifling of the barrel. Any electronic device inside would be subjected to crushing centrifugal force. The delicate vacuum tubes that formed the heart of 1940s electronics would shatter instantly. British scientists struggled to make their circuitry survive these extreme conditions. By 1940, with German bombs falling on their laboratories and cities burning around them, they faced an impossible deadline. The technology was not ready. Britain could not manufacture such a device while fighting for survival. In September 1940, a secret mission departed Britain for the United States. The Tizard mission, named after its leader, Sir Henry Tizard, carried a treasure trove of British technological secrets. Among them were designs for jet engines, advances in radar, and the preliminary research on proximity fuses. The hope was that American industrial capacity and scientific expertise could transform these concepts into working weapons. The mission succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Upon receiving the British research, the National Defense Research Committee assigned the proximity fuse project to one of America's most capable physicists. His name was Merle Tuve. Working at the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism, part of the Carnegie Institution of Washington, Tuve assembled a team of brilliant scientists and engineers. The project was designated Section T. The task before them was staggering. They needed to create a miniature radar system small enough to fit inside an artillery shell. The entire device had to occupy no more space than a pint milk bottle. It had to withstand acceleration that would crush ordinary electronics. It had to survive spinning at 30,000 revolutions per minute. It had to remain stable in temperatures ranging from 100 degrees above zero to 50 degrees below. And it had to work reliably in combat, with lives depending on every shell. Tuve understood that time was more valuable than perfection. He posted a series of dictates on the laboratory walls that became legendary among his researchers. "I do not want any damn fool in this laboratory to save money. I only want him to save time. Shoot at an 80% job, we cannot afford perfection. Do not try for an A. In a war, D is necessary and enough, but an F is fatal. The best job in the world is a total failure if it is too late. Our moral responsibility goes all the way to the final battle use of this unit. Its failure there is our failure, regardless of who is technically responsible for the causes of failure. It is our job to achieve the end result." These words drove Section T forward at a relentless pace. The team quickly outgrew the Carnegie Institution facilities. A new research center was established under the aegis of Johns Hopkins University. It was called the Applied Physics Laboratory. The primary military client was the Navy, which was desperate for a solution to aerial attack. The Japanese had just demonstrated at Pearl Harbor exactly how vulnerable ships were to enemy aircraft. Every month of delay meant more ships sunk, more sailors dead. The technical challenges seemed insurmountable. 1940s electronics relied on vacuum tubes, the bulbous glass devices that powered radios and early computers. Standard vacuum tubes were far too large and far too fragile for use in artillery shells. The first breakthrough came from a young physicist named James Van Allen. His task was to develop miniaturized vacuum tubes that could survive being shot from a gun. Van Allen, who would later discover the radiation belts around Earth that bear his name, spent nearly a year on this single problem. Through relentless experimentation, testing tubes in powerful guns and exposing them to explosives, his team gradually hardened the delicate electronic components. Meanwhile, other researchers tackled equally difficult problems. The shell needed a power source, but conventional batteries would be destroyed by the acceleration of firing. The National Carbon Company, a pioneer in dry cell batteries, developed an ingenious solution. They created a wet cell battery the size and shape of a fountain pen. The electrolyte fluid was contained in a separate glass ampule within the battery housing. When the shell was fired, the tremendous acceleration would shatter the glass and release the electrolyte. The centrifugal force of the spinning shell would then drive the fluid outward to the carbon and zinc plates, activating the battery at precisely the right moment. It was elegant engineering under extreme constraints. The heart of the device was the radar system itself. Section T refined the British concept and added crucial innovations. Lloyd Berkner developed a system using separate transmitter and receiver circuits that dramatically improved performance. The final design employed a miniature radio transmitter and receiver with an amplifier. It included a thyratron trigger, a gas-filled tube that functioned like an electronic switch. The transmitter sent out a continuous radio signal at roughly 180 to 220 megahertz, using the shell body itself as an antenna. When a target was far away, little of the transmitted energy would reflect back to the fuse. But as the shell approached a target, more of the signal would bounce back. The reflected signal would be shifted slightly in frequency due to the Doppler effect, caused by the rapid closing speed between shell and target. This frequency shift created a beat signal, a low-frequency pulse that grew stronger as the target grew closer. When the signal exceeded a certain threshold, the thyratron triggered, releasing an electrical charge that detonated the shell. The whole assembly, including the transmitter, receiver, amplifier, battery, and trigger, was packed into a housing that fit the nose of a standard artillery shell. Each complete fuse contained approximately 130 miniaturized electronic parts. It was a marvel of engineering compression. January 29, 1942, a test firing range at Dahlgren, Virginia, Section T researchers installed their prototype fuses in 5-inch projectiles and fired them from a standard anti-aircraft gun. The targets were simple, water impacts that would register hits. 52% of the fuses activated successfully. It fell short of Tuvey's requisite 80%, but it was close enough. The Navy Bureau of Ordnance immediately instructed the Crossley Corporation of Cincinnati, Ohio, to begin pilot mass production. To disguise the device's true nature, they assigned it a deliberately vague name, the Variable Time Fuse, shortened to VT Fuse. Anyone examining the designation would assume it was simply an improved timing mechanism. The true capability of the device remained a closely guarded secret. Through the spring and summer of 1942, researchers continued refining the design. They improved the battery system, hardened the electronics further, and adjusted the radar sensitivity for optimal detonation distance. The goal was to detonate the shell at precisely the moment when it was within the effective 70-yard blast radius of the target. Too soon, and the shrapnel would disperse harmlessly. Too late, and the shell might pass the target entirely. August 12, 1942. The newly commissioned light cruiser USS Cleveland was on its shakedown cruise in the Chesapeake Bay. On board were special observers from Section T. In the hold were shells fitted with the experimental VT fuses. The test was scheduled to run for 2 days. The targets were 3 radio-controlled drone aircraft, small planes maneuvered by remote control to simulate enemy aircraft. What happened next became legend within the military electronics community. The Cleveland's gunners opened fire on the first drone. It went down. They fired on the second drone. It went down. They fired on the third. It went down as well. 3 drones destroyed with just 4 bursts of proximity-fused ammunition. The evasive maneuvering programmed into the drone controls made no difference. The shells did not need to hit the targets directly. They only needed to get close. The Navy canceled the remainder of the test. There was no need for a second day. The device worked. Mass production began immediately at Crossley RCA, Eastman Kodak, General Electric, and McQuay Norris. Initial output was painfully slow, just 500 units per day by the end of 1942. But the factories were ramping up. Soon they would be producing fuses by the tens of thousands. If you are learning something new and enjoying this deep dive into military history, consider sharing this video with other history enthusiasts. The story of this secret weapon is just getting started. The first combat use came on January 5, 1943. A task force operating off Guadalcanal came under attack by 4 Japanese Aichi D-3A dive bombers. These aircraft, known to the Allies by the reporting name VAL, were slow and obsolete, but remained dangerous due to their accuracy. One scored a hit on the New Zealand light cruiser Achilles. The surviving bombers broke off their attack and began retreating. As an almost casual response, anti-aircraft gunners aboard the cruiser USS Helena fired a few salvos at the departing aircraft. 2 bursts from the 5-inch guns brought down one of the dive bombers. But here was the crucial detail. The shell had not struck the aircraft directly. It had passed close enough to detonate automatically, sending a blast of shrapnel into the Japanese plane and fatally damaging it. The engagement received no public attention at the time. The Navy's announcement was deliberately understated, but those who understood what had happened recognized a transformative moment in military history. For the first time, an enemy aircraft had been deliberately destroyed by a near miss. The rules of aerial warfare had changed forever. Over the following months, VT-fused ammunition proved devastatingly effective in the Pacific theater. During the Solomon Islands campaign, Admiral William Halsey's task forces came under repeated night attacks by Japanese torpedo bombers. The Mitsubishi G4M, known to the Allies as Betty, approached under cover of darkness to launch their deadly payloads. Against conventional anti-aircraft fire, these night attacks had been extremely dangerous for the American fleet. But the VT fuse changed the equation. Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison described the aftermath of these engagements. The attackers did not escape with whole hides. Smoking fuselages and bright surface bonfires attested the accuracy of anti-aircraft batteries and the efficiency of the super-secret Mark 32 shell fuse. In one February night attack by a dozen Betty bombers, Morrison recorded, the night flickered with muzzle flashes, tracers, flares, float lights, and the flaming pyramids of splashing Bettys. 5 attackers were downed and a convoy saved by excellent anti-aircraft formation in conjunction with fire control radar and the deadly proximity fuse. By the end of 1943, VT-fused anti-aircraft fire was credited with more than half of all Japanese aircraft destroyed by naval gunfire. This achievement was even more remarkable considering that only 25% of the shells fired had been fitted with the experimental fuses. The device was so valuable and so secret that supplies were carefully rationed. The secrecy surrounding the VT fuse was extraordinary, comparable only to the Manhattan Project and the D-Day invasion plans. Admiral Lewis Strauss later wrote that while no one invention won the war, the proximity fuse must be listed among the very small group of developments, such as radar, upon which victory very largely depended. The fear was that if the Germans or Japanese obtained even a single unexploded fuse, they could reverse engineer the technology and use it against Allied forces. German scientists had been working on their own proximity fuse designs since the early 1930s. More than 30 different concepts were under development in Nazi Germany, but German researchers had concluded that a practical proximity fuse for artillery was impossible. The miniaturization required, the hardening of components, the reliability under extreme stress, all seemed beyond the limits of technology. If they learned that the Americans had solved these problems, the consequences could be catastrophic. For this reason, the VT fuse was initially restricted to naval use only. Shells fired over water would sink if they failed to detonate, making capture by enemy forces nearly impossible. Ground forces were forbidden from using the device. Even in the Pacific, where American troops were fighting their way across island after island, the proximity fuse was off-limits for field artillery. Commanders who knew about the device chafed at the restriction. The fuse's ability to create perfectly timed airbursts would be devastating against enemy infantry. A shell detonating 30 feet above ground would shower shrapnel over a wide area, penetrating foxholes and trenches that would protect soldiers from conventional ground impact explosions. But the risk of capture was deemed too great. The policy held firm through 1943 and into 1944. Meanwhile, production increased exponentially. By late 1943, American factories were assembling 40,000 fuse per day. 70 different versions were eventually produced, adapted for various calibers of American and British naval and anti-aircraft guns. More than 100 companies were involved in manufacturing components. The entire American electronics industry devoted a significant portion of its capacity to this single secret project. Procurement contracts grew from $60 million in 1942 to $200 million in 1943 to $300 million in 1944. Efficiency improvements drove the cost per fuse from $732 in 1942 down to just $18 by 1945. The restriction on land use finally cracked in the summer of 1944. The circumstances were desperate. Germany had unleashed a new terror weapon against Britain. The V-1 flying bomb, a pilotless jet-propelled missile carrying nearly 2,000 pounds of explosives, began raining down on London in June. The buzz bombs, named for the distinctive sound of their pulse jet engines, killed and wounded tens of thousands of civilians. They caused widespread destruction and severely damaged British morale. The V-1s presented a nearly impossible target for conventional anti-aircraft guns. They flew at speeds approaching 400 miles per hour, much faster than manned aircraft. They were small, with wingspans of less than 18 feet, and they followed unpredictable trajectories with no pilot to respond to defensive fire in predictable ways. British gunners fired thousands of rounds at each incoming missile, hitting almost none of them. Barrage balloons caught a few. RAF fighter pilots, in acts of extraordinary courage, learned to fly alongside the missiles and tip them with their wing tips, sending them spinning out of control. But most V-1s got through. Section T rushed to modify proximity fuses for the specific task of intercepting flying bombs. The fuses were adapted for British 3.7-inch and American 90-millimeter anti-aircraft ammunition. Special adjustments were made to ensure detonation at the optimal distance from these small, fast targets. In mid-July, the Allies deployed roughly 500 VT-fused guns along the English coast, positioned so that shells missing their targets would fall into the sea rather than on land, where they might be recovered. The results were immediate and dramatic. In the first week, the gun batteries destroyed 24% of all V-1s engaged. In the second week, the kill rate rose to 46%. By the third week, 67% of flying bombs passing through the coastal gun belt were shot down. In the final week of the campaign, the rate reached 79%. Ralph Belknap Baldwin, a senior physicist at APL who had helped develop the fuse, recorded the final day of major V-1 attacks. On the last day in which a large quantity of V-1s were launched against England, 104 were detected by early warning radar. Only 4 reached London. The combination of proximity fuses, radar-directed fire control, and specialized computing equipment had created the most effective air defense system the world had ever seen. The devastation that the Nazis had hoped to inflict on London was largely prevented by a device that could fit in the nose of an artillery shell. The breakthrough on the V-1 defenses opened the door for broader use of the proximity fuse. But the greatest test was yet to come. On December 16, 1944, the Germans launched their final major offensive of the war in the West. Operation Watch on the Rhine, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, threw more than 200,000 German troops against a thinly defended sector of the American line in the Ardennes forest of Belgium and Luxembourg. The attack achieved complete surprise. German forces smashed through the American positions, creating a deep bulge in the Allied front line that gave the battle its name. Snow and freezing temperatures grounded Allied aircraft, neutralizing the overwhelming air superiority that had protected American ground forces throughout the campaign in France. For the first time since Normandy, German tanks and infantry could maneuver without fear of air attack. The situation was desperate. If German forces broke through to the port of Antwerp, they could split the Allied armies and potentially force a negotiated peace. Within 2 days of the German attack, General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, demanded that the ban on land use of proximity fuses be lifted. The Pentagon agreed. 200,000 VT-fused shells, codenamed Posset, were released for use by Allied field artillery. The devices had been adapted and tested for all calibers of American artillery pieces, and large supplies had been shipped to the European theater in anticipation of just such an emergency. Now they would finally be used. The effect on the German offensive was immediate and catastrophic. For years, German soldiers had learned to survive artillery bombardments through a combination of dispersion, cover, and timing. When you heard incoming shells, you hit the ground or dove into a foxhole. Shell fragments from a ground impact traveled outward and upward. If you were below ground level, you had a good chance of survival. Trenches, foxholes, even shell craters from previous barrages provided protection. German veterans of the Eastern Front, where Soviet artillery was used in massive quantities, had become expert at surviving bombardment. The SS units fighting in the Ardennes included some of the most combat-experienced soldiers in the German military. They knew how to handle artillery, or they thought they did. The VT-fused shells changed everything. These shells did not impact the ground. They detonated in midair, typically 20 to 50 feet above the surface. The explosion occurred directly overhead, showering shrapnel straight down into foxholes and trenches. There was no warning. Artillery shells travel faster than sound. You could not hear them coming until they had already detonated. And unlike timed fuses, which required forward observers to adjust fire, and which often detonated too high or too low, the proximity fuse guaranteed perfect air burst height every single time. The shell would descend toward the target, its miniature radar constantly measuring the distance to the ground. At precisely the optimal moment for maximum lethality, it would explode. One report from the Hürtgen Forest described the aftermath of a Posset artillery barrage. 96 German soldiers from a patrol had been caught in the open. Their bodies looked as if they had gone through a meat grinder. A chief ordnance officer in the European theater made that grim observation. The forest canopy that German troops used for concealment provided no protection. In fact, it made things worse. When VT-fused shells detonated among the treetops, they sent shrapnel and wood splinters slicing downward. One report stated that after an artillery barrage with proximity shells, the forest looked like a giant scythe had cut the tops of the trees off, destroying everything above 40 feet and killing many of those beneath the barrage. The dense Ardennes forest, which German commanders had selected specifically because it would provide cover from Allied air power, had become a death trap. Captured German prisoners provided intelligence officers with a vivid picture of the psychological impact. POW interviews often described enemy soldiers emerging from the barrages in a dazed state. They realized they were facing a new kind of artillery, but could understand neither how it worked nor how to evade it. Every defensive technique they had learned was suddenly useless. Foxholes that had saved their lives on the Eastern Front now offered no protection. Bunkers reinforced with logs, which could withstand near misses from conventional shells, were penetrated by the shrapnel raining down from above. The shells seemed to possess an evil intelligence, waiting until the perfect moment to explode. German soldiers began calling them ghost shells. Some wondered if the Americans had developed some form of black magic. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical casualties. Troops who survived the barrages were often too shocked to fight effectively. The effectiveness of VT-fused artillery in the Ardennes was amplified by another technological innovation. Fire control radar allowed American artillery batteries to target German positions without direct observation. Conventional artillery required forward observers to spot the fall of shells and radio adjustments back to the gun crews. But in the dense forests and poor weather of the Ardennes, observation was often impossible. Radar changed this. Artillery equipped with SCR-584 automatic tracking radar could calculate firing solutions mathematically, dropping shells onto targets that no human eye could see. Combined with the proximity fuse, this meant that German units could be devastated without warning in any weather, day or night, even when they believed themselves to be safely hidden behind hills or beneath forest canopy. The old rules of artillery defense no longer applied. The siege of Bastogne became the most famous engagement of the Battle of the Bulge. The town sat at a crucial crossroads, and American forces, primarily the 101st Airborne Division, were surrounded by German troops. The defenders were cut off, low on ammunition, food, and medical supplies. German commanders demanded their surrender. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe famously replied with a single word: nuts. What is less well known is the crucial role that proximity-fused artillery played in the defense of Bastogne. The all-African-American 969th Artillery Battalion formed part of the defensive ring around the town. Their 155mm howitzers, firing VT-fused shells, created what survivors described as a ring of death around Bastogne's perimeter that German forces found impenetrable. The 420th Armored Field Artillery Battalion alone fired over 1,000 rounds on Christmas Day, most fitted with proximity fuses. Their M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers delivered rapid, accurate fire that caught German units completely unprepared. German infantry advancing across snow-covered fields in traditional formations were caught in the open. The proximity-fused shells detonated overhead with precise timing, creating overlapping patterns of destruction that left no safe zones. Field kitchens, supply convoys, and assembly areas came under devastating bombardment that required no forward observers. The German offensive depended on capturing American supply depots to fuel their advance. When those supply points were defended by VT-fused artillery, the assaults became suicidal. Wave after wave of German troops were cut down by shells that exploded with uncanny precision at exactly the wrong moment for the attackers. At Elsenborn Ridge on the northern shoulder of the Bulge, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions held critical terrain against repeated German assaults. The fighting here was among the most intense of the entire battle. German forces, including elite SS units, threw themselves against the American positions again and again. American artillery, now firing with proximity fuses, took a terrible toll. In the northern sector opposite the 99th Division, more than 4,000 Germans were killed and 60 tanks and heavy guns destroyed. Historian John Eisenhower, son of the Supreme Allied Commander, later wrote that the action of the 2nd and 99th Divisions on the northern shoulder could be considered the most decisive of the Ardennes campaign. Much of their success was due to artillery support that had suddenly become far more lethal than anything the Germans had experienced before. Take a moment to hit the like button if this story of wartime innovation has captured your attention. The conclusion of the Bulge demonstrates just how decisive this secret weapon became. The German offensive in the Ardennes ultimately failed. Multiple factors contributed to the defeat. German forces ran out of fuel. The weather cleared, allowing Allied aircraft to resume operations. American reinforcements, including General George Patton's Third Army racing north from the Saar region, struck the southern flank of the German penetration. But among all the factors that turned the tide, one stands out for the sheer disproportion between its size and its effect. A device the size of a pint milk bottle, fitted to the nose of artillery shells, transformed the battlefield calculus of the entire campaign. General George Patton, never a man given to understatement, made his assessment clear in a letter to Major General Levin Campbell, Jr., the Chief of Army Ordnance. The funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us. I think that when all the armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare. I am glad that you all thought of it first. The casualties inflicted by proximity-fused artillery during the Ardennes campaign will never be precisely known. German record-keeping had largely broken down by late 1944, and many units were too disorganized to file accurate reports. But the accounts from survivors, the observations of Allied troops who occupied former German positions, and the reports of intelligence officers who interrogated prisoners all paint the same picture. The VT fuse transformed American artillery from a serious threat into an instrument of mass destruction. Units that had fought across Russia, that had survived Stalingrad and Kursk, found themselves helpless against shells that seemed to know exactly when and where to explode. The effect on German morale was profound. One account described a minor mutiny when German soldiers started refusing to advance against American positions defended by the mysterious exploding shells. They had survived years of brutal combat. Now they faced a weapon against which courage and training provided no defense. The final months of the war saw proximity fuses used with increasing frequency and effect. As Allied forces crossed the Rhine and advanced into Germany itself, VT-fused anti-aircraft shells became the primary defense against last-ditch Luftwaffe attacks. From the Rhine crossing to Berlin, proximity-fused Allied anti-aircraft fire brought down more than 1,000 enemy aircraft. The Luftwaffe, already crippled by fuel shortages and pilot losses, was finished as an effective fighting force. German ground troops fared no better. Every attempt to mass forces for counterattacks was met by artillery barrages that seemed to detonate with supernatural precision. The ability to hide in forests, to use terrain for cover, to dig in and wait for the bombardment to pass, all the survival techniques that soldiers had used since the invention of artillery no longer worked. The proximity fuse had rendered them obsolete. The scale of the American proximity fuse program was staggering. By war's end, more than 22 million fuses had been manufactured, each containing approximately 130 miniaturized electronic parts. The total cost exceeded $1 billion in 1940s currency, equivalent to roughly $15 billion today. Production peaked at 70,000 units per day. More than 100 companies were involved in manufacturing, from electronics giants like RCA and General Electric to specialized suppliers of capacitors, resistors, and miniature vacuum tubes. The program represented one of the largest mobilizations of industrial capacity for a single military technology in history. The secrecy surrounding the VT fuse was maintained throughout the war. Every fuse was tracked and accounted for. Gunners were strictly ordered to fire only in situations where unexploded rounds could not be recovered by the enemy. Stories circulated of artillery officers spending hours searching for dud shells after engagements to ensure no sample fell into German hands. The Germans knew they were facing something new. Captured soldiers described the uncanny accuracy of American artillery, but German scientists never successfully identified the mechanism. Their own proximity fuse programs, more than 30 separate designs, never produced a working device for artillery shells. They had concluded years earlier that the engineering challenges were insurmountable. The Americans, driven by necessity and guided by brilliant scientists, proved them wrong. What made the American success possible? Several factors combined. First, the willingness to accept imperfect solutions. Merle Tuve's dictates about preferring a D grade today over an A grade tomorrow drove the program forward when perfectionism might have caused fatal delays. Second, the extraordinary cooperation between government laboratories, universities, and private industry. Section T drew on expertise from the Carnegie Institution, Johns Hopkins University, General Electric, RCA, Sylvania, National Carbon, and dozens of other organizations. Third, the sheer scale of American industrial capacity. When the design was finalized, American factories could produce millions of units with consistent quality. No other nation had this combination of scientific expertise and manufacturing capability. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, the culture of practical problem-solving that characterized American engineering. When miniature vacuum tubes shattered under the stress of firing, James Van Allen found ways to make them stronger. When conventional batteries failed, National Carbon invented a new type of wet cell. When radar circuits were too large, researchers found ways to compress them. Every obstacle was met with innovation. The legacy of the proximity fuse extended far beyond the Second World War. The miniaturization techniques developed for the fuse program laid the groundwork for post-war electronics. The manufacturing methods pioneered by Section T contractors were among the first large-scale applications of printed circuits. The organizations created to develop the fuse, particularly the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, continued as major defense research institutions for decades. And the fundamental concept of a munition that could sense its environment and make autonomous decisions about detonation opened the door to the precision-guided weapons that would transform warfare in subsequent decades. In a very real sense, every smart bomb, every cruise missile, every guided artillery round in modern arsenals descends from the VT fuse. For the German soldiers who experienced proximity-fused artillery in the Ardennes, none of this future mattered. They knew only that shells were exploding above their heads, that foxholes no longer provided protection, that the Americans had somehow developed a weapon against which there was no defense. The elite SS units who had been the spearhead of the offensive, men who had fought on the Eastern Front and believed themselves invincible, found themselves as vulnerable as raw recruits. Their combat experience, their tactical training, their vaunted discipline, none of it helped against shells that detonated with perfect timing in midair. Many would not survive the war. Those who did carried the memory of those terrible days in the frozen forests of Belgium when death rained down from a clear sky with no warning and no escape. The Battle of the Bulge cost Germany dearly. Between 63,000 and 100,000 German soldiers became casualties. Hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles were destroyed. The Wehrmacht's last reserves of trained manpower and equipment were consumed in a futile offensive that achieved nothing. The war would continue for another 4 months, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. American and British forces in the West, Soviet forces in the East, would crush Nazi Germany between them. The VT fuse did not win the war by itself. No single weapon ever does. But it contributed to victory in a proportion far exceeding its size. A device that fit in a man's hand helped break the last major German offensive and demonstrated that American technological ingenuity could overcome any obstacle. When George Patton credited the funny fuse with winning the Battle of the Bulge, he was not exaggerating by much. Today, visitors to the Ardennes can walk through forests where the fighting occurred. The trees have regrown, but you can still find shell craters if you know where to look. Local museums display artifacts recovered from the battlefield, including expended shell casings and fragments of military equipment. But you will not find a VT fuse on display in Belgium. The secrecy was too complete, the recovery efforts too thorough. The device that helped win the battle remains largely invisible to history, overshadowed by the heroism of soldiers like the defenders of Bastogne. That is fitting in a way. The men who fought in the Bulge did not know why American artillery had suddenly become so deadly. They only knew that it worked. The scientists and engineers of Section T remained anonymous for years after the war. Their contribution to victory was measured in German casualties and saved American lives, not in medals or public recognition. The proximity fuse was a weapon of mass effect, but individual obscurity. The story of the VT fuse holds lessons that remain relevant today. Innovation under pressure can achieve what seems impossible. Cooperation between scientists, engineers, and manufacturers can compress decades of development into months. And technology, properly applied, can change the balance of power on the battlefield in ways that commanders never anticipated. The German generals who planned the Ardennes offensive did not factor proximity fuses into their calculations. They knew about Allied air power. They knew about American tanks and artillery. They planned around weather that would ground the planes and terrain that would channel the armor. But they did not know about the secret shells that would rain death from above with uncanny precision. By the time they understood what was happening, it was too late. Their offensive had failed, their armies were shattered, and the war was lost. If you have watched to this point, subscribe to this channel for more deep dives into military history. The weapons that changed warfare, the battles that shaped nations, the soldiers who paid the ultimate price, these stories deserve to be told. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on the proximity fuse and whether you had heard of this secret weapon before. History is full of technological innovations that arrived at decisive moments to change the course of wars. The VT fuse stands among the most important of them all. A billion-dollar gamble on an impossible idea, developed in secret, deployed at the perfect moment, and devastating in its effect. The elite SS units in the Ardennes never saw it coming. They only experienced its lethal consequences. Shells exploding overhead in the frozen forests, shrapnel descending without warning into positions that should have been safe. The secret shell made them helpless, and it helped bring their war to an end.